Okay, so let us start now. So today it is an introduction to Jenkins and how probably we are going to set up the Jenkins, and this is a continuous integration and continuous deployment tool that would be useful for you. So obviously so you should know this because it will also be helpful for implementing your project. So that is the topic for today. So when you look at the concept of Jenkins, initially we would like to see a small introduction on Jenkins. So what is Jenkins? So Jenkins is the leading open source continuous integration tool. Jenkins was originally developed with the name as the Hudson Project. It was started in 2004 by Sun Microsystems. So soon after it was started, about 6 months down the line, in not even no 6 years, 6 years down the line in 2010, there arose an issue in the Hudson community with respect to the infrastructure used. So there were some kind of negotiations that were held between the project contributors and Oracle, and then in 2011 this project from Hudson was renamed as Jenkins. So this was the initial thing, how a Jenkins, an open source continuous integration tool, started off as a Hudson project, was then renamed as Jenkins. So later, sometime again down the line in February 2011, so Oracle said, they wanted to continue the development of the Hudson, and again 5 years down the line in December 2014, the Jenkins on the GitHub had 638 project members, 1,800 public repositories, and so on. And that is how Jenkins grew in leaps and bounds compared to the Hudson project. So as on date, Hudson is not maintained anymore, and Jenkins has become a replacement for Hudson. So Jenkins is definitely a very useful tool in the industry. It is basically used for building and testing our software continuously, and it basically monitors the execution and status of remote jobs, and it obviously makes it easier for team members and users as well. So Jenkins is going to be a very interesting tool for all of you to work on. So I strongly recommend you go back after this lecture, download Jenkins into your local machines, and then obviously try out how a Jenkins would basically work. And at the end of the project, you would be able to do a continuous integration using Jenkins if you are probably able to download and install Jenkins. So if you look at what a Jenkins could probably do, a Jenkins is basically used for testing, building, and deployment. So it talks of the basic software, its corresponding services, and its associated infrastructure. So Jenkins has obviously capabilities to do testing, then build your application code, and obviously deploy your code on to the end user. So that is the powerful feature of Jenkins. The next obvious question is, I'm going to probably automate this Jenkins tool. Why is this automation needed? This automation basically is needed for certain key purposes. This basically makes the build processes transparent, This will make the build process improvable. This will make the build process reproducible, and it also serves as lower the barrier to update Jenkins. So these are certain obvious reasons why it is required to automate Jenkins: transparency, improvement, reproducibility, and obviously this lowers the barrier to update the software. So when I look at Jenkins automation might not be a very easy task. So automation becomes difficult for certain obvious reasons. The first and foremost obvious reason is building software is very difficult. For long, Jenkins has been strongly UI driven. The second obvious reason is, it is easy to deploy a WAR file, when you can probably deploy it on your laptop. And the third obvious reason why it becomes hard or difficult to automate Jenkins is, Jenkins comes with a lot of plugins. And most of these plugins would obviously be required. And these three key reasons make Jenkins very difficult to automate. So the next obvious question is, when you look at automation, what are the various things that are possible to be automated? There are 6 to 7 things, that you can probably automate in Jenkins. Then when you look at the first one is nothing but the operating system. The operating system Jenkins is running on could be automated. The next thing that you can probably look at for automation, so first one is the operating system itself. It could be Windows, Linux, or whatever you could call. You will be able to automate that as well. Yeah. So the operating system Jenkins is currently running on could be automated. The second one is the kind of service. Yeah. The Jenkins service that could be automated. Jenkins basically has start a service. You could obviously look at stopping the service or reloading the service. So these are certain options that are obviously available in your Jenkins, and you should be able to do that. The third one is called plugins. You might have heard of the plugins. So you will be able to automate which plugins to install, the version of the plugin which you would like to install, and importantly the configuration. Yeah. So these are three things you obviously need to look at. So which plugin am I interested to install? Okay, I have identified the plugin. The next obvious question is the version. Yeah, which version I will be installing, and the configuration. Then the fourth kind of things that can be obviously automated is the Jenkins global configuration. So you can probably look at the SMTP server, the simple mail transfer protocol. Yeah. That obviously comes with an email address. Then obviously there are two things that are obviously required. The one is called authentication. The next one is called authorization. You should obviously understand the difference between authentication and authorization. Authentication basically says whether you are an authenticated user, and authorization says, okay, you are an authenticated user, but are you authorized to view certain things is what will be probably found out. The next things is which you can probably automate is the jobs views folder. The views will obviously help people. The jobs and folders are basically used for creation and deletion. You call it something to be the jobs views folder. Yeah. So view is something like, just to have a look at it. The jobs and folders are the different jobs that you need to probably carry out to automate a particular software, and obviously you look at how you can do that in the respective folders as well. Then you have something called the jobs definition. That basically looks at the content, the steps to build it, and the deployment configuration. So when you could probably identify a job, then you look at its content, then obviously you will look at the steps that are need to be carried out in the building process, and third, you obviously will look out at the deployment configuration, because deployment is very, very important. Yeah, at the end of the day, I obviously need to go and deploy things. Yeah, so that is what I look at. And when you probably look at the operating system you build your software on, so I will be basically looking at the different nodes on the Jenkins and where probably your jobs could run. So your jobs could either run on a Linux platform, or it could probably run on an Android operating system, and you probably need to take care of where you probably want to build your software and make it run. Yeah, so these are the 7 key things obviously you need to remember as to what are the things probably you could automate in Jenkins. Next, you need to look at what is continuous integration. Continuous integration is a development practice. What basically is carried out in continuous integration? Developers are required to commit changes to the source code. All these will go into a shared repository. That is what I told you. For example, it could be a GitHub. And this kind of changes that are committed to the source code might happen several times in a day. And every time you commit, every commit is then built. Yeah, once you commit it, then you build it. And once you build, you will be able to detect the problems. So committing and building at an early stage will uncover majority of the problems or defects at an early stage, which will obviously lead to lesser maintenance cost, higher quality. Obviously, quality is the bedrock of software engineering. So obviously this is required. So that is why continuous integration basically gains importance. So what are some of the benefits that would obviously come along with it if I can do continuous integration? Detecting errors or problems in the beginning will basically lead to probably solving it at an early stage. It's going to be transparent where everybody will be able to see what is happening. You can automate the build, and then important, continuous integration will lead to continuous deployment. You know, once you are able to do a continuous integration, this continuous integration leads to continuous deployment. And once you are able to do continuous deployment successfully, this will allow us to deliver software more quickly. Okay. Now, looking at this flow chart, which basically describes how continuous integration would probably work. Continuous integration is very simple, as I told you orally in the earlier thing. So you commit changes to the source code, then you probably load it onto a continuous integration server. The server will build your code, it will do testing, and then it will do deployment. The continuous integration server has capabilities to provide constant feedback to the developers. Based on the feedback, you will modify your code and then again feed it back to the continuous integration server. So once you are able to do it, then you build it, you identify the defects at an earlier stage, rectify them, and then obviously you will be able to produce a better quality product by using what is called continuous deployment. So what is continuous integration? From Martin Fowler, the chief scientist from ThoughtWorks. So Martin says continuous integration does not get rid of bugs. Yeah, it is not a magic tool to probably get rid of all the bugs that you have introduced into your code. Continuous integration basically will make them dramatically easier to find and remove the bugs. So Jenkins is no magic tool. So what is Jenkins? Jenkins is basically a tool or a framework that will achieve continuous integration by using certain plugins. That is what I told you earlier itself. Jenkins might be a bit difficult because it has thousands of plugins, and most of these plugins will obviously be helpful for me. So probably it's definitely going to be useful for me. Yeah. So the Jenkins is no magic tool. Okay. So it will probably aid the programmer, the developer, and everybody to find the bugs early in the software, and then you would obviously be able to produce a better quality product at the end of the day. Yeah. So that is the basic purpose of using Jenkins. So whenever I talk of plugins, I told you there are thousands of plugins in Jenkins. Jenkins basically supports all of these plugins, Okay, so how do I probably go look at what kind of plugins are available in Jenkins? So there is something called the plugin categorization. The categorization is basically divided into 5 things, The first one could be, based on something called the compilation, then deployment, compilation, deployment, notifications, testing, and reports. Obviously, if your code is probably written in Java, you use JUnit for testing. You obviously need certain tools like HTML publishers for report generation. You need certain tools for compiling your code. You obviously need certain plugins for deploying your code once your build is successful. Yeah, and certain kind of notifications based on some kind of, say, error messages or whatever you could call. For that as well, you will definitely need plugins. So how do I basically install and configure Jenkins? So one necessary thing before you download Jenkins into your local machine and start installing it, make sure you have a JDK and 1.7 or above. Obviously the recommended memory everybody would have, it's something like a 2 GB RAM. There is no minimum requirement of disk space. All builds will be stored on the Jenkins machine. So it is always better you have some amount of disk space on your machines, because sufficient disk space is available for build storage. When you look at the operating system's version, absolutely no problem. You can run on a Windows, you can run on an Ubuntu, you can run on a Red Hat, CentOS, Mac OS, or whatever. Jenkins is going to be an open source, free of charge, so no problem at all. Then Jenkins requires something like a Java container to run. It has a war file, and obviously you need to have something like a Tomcat server as well. Because you need to probably build the application, then you need to do a continuous integration and so on. So obviously it requires something like a Tomcat web server in order for the Jenkins to work properly. So I'm just giving you a quick snapshot of how you can probably install and configure Jenkins. So download Jenkins from the official site. The URL is mentioned here. You can always go and then Google it as well, no problem. From the command prompt, browse to the directory where you have the jenkins.war file. Then from the command prompt, you can run this command, java-jar jenkins.war. Then extraction of this war file is done by an embedded web server called the Winstone that comes obviously with Jenkins. Jenkins normally runs on port number 8080. It is also possible to redirect Jenkins to run on a different port number by using this command, java-jar jenkins.var http port equal to a port number. So to start with, as far as possible, it is recommended you run it on the default port 8080. And once you are used to using Jenkins, probably you can try redirecting it to a different port number. Then you open http://localhost:8080, assuming you are running it on the port number 8080/Jenkins. This will open a Jenkins dashboard. Then you can get the Jenkins-git setup enabled by clicking the Manage Jenkins option. Then you can install the Git plugin and restart Jenkins by issuing this command in your web browser, http://localhost:8080/Jenkins/restart. Once you are probably able to do this successfully, then it is assumed that you are probably ready to work on this Jenkins software. Please try it out. Jenkins software is going to be very, very interesting for you, without any kind of a manual intervention. Just by checking your code into a GitHub repository, you will be able to build the software, then find out certain bugs in it, correct it, and then probably go for a continuous integration and obviously you will also be able to do a continuous deployment as well. So please try out Jenkins hands-on, and then it will be very, very helpful. So another obvious question, since you're running something on a server, how do I manage the security? Because there could be multiple users who are operating Jenkins for the same set of projects, holding different responsibility, right? So obviously there is a question of how do I manage the security. So it is very, very important that you restrict access for users so that they can operate on their responsibility in a controlled manner. So how do I do that? Very simple. To manage access of users, click on Manage Jenkins from the home page. Click on the link Configure Global Security. You go to Access Control. You will see an authorization label. From the authorization label, you will be able to control the aspect of security for the different kinds of users who are probably working on the same set of project. Because you might have a business analyst, you might have a developer, you might have a tester, and so on. So it is very obvious that you manage the security properly by using these kind of options. So when I would like to create a job with Jenkins, how do I do it? To create a new build job in Jenkins, go to the Jenkins dashboard, click on New Item. Put a very specific name for your project, then you can select your project type. In the next step, go to Setup Configurations. You will look at configuring the global tool configuration. You need to probably give the JDK path, the Git configuration, the Maven installations, and all these things as per the requirement of your project. Then you go for creating or updating things, where you will look at several settings like the general settings, source code management, all these things, build, post steps, email notifications, and all these things you will find, and you can probably do all of these things as per the requirements for your project. So that is why I tell you, please go and almost you would have completed the project and on agile mode, and probably you are ready for continuous integration and deployment. Please try it out. Now we look at quickly what is inside Jenkins. What is inside? So the first one we look at is the multiple approaches that are available to operate Jenkins. So when you look at the multiple approaches, the first one is the GUI, the graphical user interface. But I'm looking at automation. The next one is called the Jenkins Job Builder. You remember we have seen about declarative and so on. Python is a programming language. We have also seen something on YAML, imperative, groovy, and so on. So these are the several multiple approaches that are basically available in order to operate Jenkins. Then you have something called the Jenkins Job Builder. This is an OpenStack project. I'm putting Python here, though Python is not a Jenkins plugin. It will support several templates. This job builder is definitely extensible, like XML. That's what it says, you can do raw XML, and this job builder has very limited support for plugins and pipeline. These are certain key features that you obviously will be interested in by looking at the Jenkins job builder. So when you look at the Jenkins job DSL, this is a Jenkins plugin introduced in 2012 that has a groovy DSL to create views and jobs. And all the jobs need to be put under a software configuration management. The jobs configuration will all go into the software configuration management tool. Then how does this probably provide support is the next obvious question. This job DSL provides support to a large community of users. When I started the presentation, I very clearly told you how many people are basically associated currently with this project. Thousands, right? So that itself says, what is the kind of support is given. And I already told you in the start of the class that there are a lot of plugins that are basically supported, nearly thousands of plugins, and that is how you get suitable support for a particular kind of a job. So this is probably a quick flow of work on the Jenkins. What you do is create individual jobs, then you create a pipeline. What is a pipeline is very simple. I told you, you take job 1, 2, 3, connect job 2 to job 1, connect job 3 to job 2, and so on. That is something called chaining. Then you go for setting the properties for the job, individual jobs. Some of the jobs might have loops or iterations to run on. Look at that. Then you probably need to look at creating views. Then you probably need to look at how can you work with the different plugins. Then you will look at the pipeline. Then you can probably load the extra libraries that are obviously required for Jenkins to work properly. And as the last step, you will read the YAML. So create a job, create a pipeline, set its properties, look at the loops, create a view so that users can view it, and then you go on, and in the last step you go for creating a YAML and loading it accordingly. Having seen all of these things, we will also be interested in looking at the pros and cons of Jenkins. So when I say pros and cons, it is nothing but the advantages and disadvantages of Jenkins. The font size may be a bit smaller, but I will tell you what it is. Very simple, Obviously, I mentioned any kind of an application, project, tool, anything you use definitely will have advantages and disadvantages. So now, looking at the advantages of Jenkins, what am I interested in is, Jenkins makes it trivial to deploy in a GitOps friendly way. You have something called the Blue Ocean plus material themes, and this makes it look like any other modern CI/CD system. Jenkins comes with thousands of plugins, so it has a rich ecosystem of plugins, much more than any SaaS. Software as a service, definitely. Then its overall simple architecture to deploy. I showed you the architecture, it's very easy, right? So you write the code, you check it into a GitHub repository, then you build the code, then you probably get favorable feedback, and then you go for continuous integration and deployment. No need to run tons of backing services, right? Architecture is simple. It will easily attract metrics from your build system into a platform like Prometheus. You will be able to achieve greater economies of scale by leveraging all this infrastructure to build your projects. And another key advantage which you would obviously be interested in is Jenkins is 100% free and open source. You can always upgrade and then get any kind of a commercial support, and this makes Jenkins a very powerful and very famous tool in the industry nowadays. Even though Jenkins has a lot of advantages, Jenkins somehow comes with its disadvantages too. So Jenkins has a lot of redundant plugins. Knowing which one to use takes some kind of time, and some kind of experimentation. Sometimes your experimentation might fail as well. The most common example is the Docker. Jenkins has many plugins that seem no longer maintained, That is another problem. Not all plugins are compatible with declarative pipelines, yeah? That is another important thing. Sometimes you may need to probably use what is called the imperative pipeline as well. So maybe a few dozen plugins are required to modernize Jenkins. The more plugins, the greater the chance there will be problems during upgrades. Then there is no properly maintained YAML interface for the Jenkins pipeline. And obviously what happens here is, there is a lot of state or out of the state documentation for Jenkins. So looking at the pros and cons of Jenkins, it is still recommended that you probably download Jenkins to your local machines, try out Jenkins, and then you can probably use Jenkins for your academic project you have probably executed on the agile mode. Most of the industries still use this Jenkins for their continuous integration, and further that leads to the continuous deployment. So it is always recommended you probably familiarize yourself with this tool so that it will be very helpful once you join the industry after your PG. So that is why I tell you it is always recommended you try using